Namaskar. Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I'm your host Sree Iyer. Joining me again is Pandit Satish K Sharma ji. Pandit ji, in this ongoing series of conversations, help us understand this. We are all looking at United Kingdom, and we see two narratives emerging. The mainstream media is saying one thing, and the social media is saying something else. And we're trying to understand this rationale of having so many illegals being brought in. And even though, for example, some of the other European nations are now saying enough, but UK is continuing. So somewhere we're confused. Unravel this picture for us.
Yeah, great question. There was a period of time when in the United Kingdom, we were all asking the same question. It didn't make sense to us. We had grassroots, first-hand accounts of people saying, this is what's happening. And yet the mainstream media was flipping it, either ignoring it completely or painting a totally different picture. So there was a big mismatch there. And I think what's emerging now is similar to what's happened here in the United States. For quite some time under the Democrats, people were unable to make sense of what was going on. They were being told that there are men, women, and 72 other groupings or something like this, and people saying, it doesn't make sense to us. Why are we being coerced into going down this route, which makes no sense to us? Britain is probably in the same state at this moment. Here in the US, though, you've had a wonderful development in that the things that didn't make sense are now beginning to make sense because of the work of Donald Trump, the work of Elon Musk and Doge, the recent revelations about USAID. How many of us suspected
for a long time,
the extent and the depth of what was going on? Most people knew that there was some sort of tinkering or tampering, illegal activities going on, but the depth and the scale is only now becoming clear. So what I think you're seeing here is an unveiling of what's being called the deep state. No one can deny that there is something behind government which has been working, probably for the detriment of the citizens of the United States, for a long time. In the UK, we're seeing the same phenomenon happening. People have been asking the same questions. Things that didn't make sense are now beginning to be pieced together slowly, and a picture is forming. And it's an interesting picture. As you know, I have a historical sort of research hobby, as it were. I have a historical research angle to the work that I do, and I'm now beginning to be able to paint a picture which I think explains everything. And I'm going to share it with you. It'll probably form the contents of my new book. But the idea is that in the United Kingdom, we have had for a long time a state within a state which has sold itself to the people as being democratic, when the reality is that the manner in which it conducts its affairs are actually identical to the way in which a slave plantation was run in the deep south of the United States. Let me just sort of expand on that. In the slave plantations, the slaves were not citizens. They were livestock. And when they became less than profitable, or they became too old and couldn't breed anymore, they were culled, and a new fresh batch of livestock was brought in. Now, if the British deep state were to think of its citizens not as citizens, but as livestock, then you would see it in the decisions that are being made. And so when you see the fact that the pensioners, all of a sudden, Britain can't afford to pay them a winter fuel allowance, which is not very much, but it can afford to put aside £100 million for Ukraine for 100 years. Where's that money coming from? We could have saved a few pensioners, unless, of course, the pensioners are livestock and they're not productive. And so it's not in your interest to look after them. So you would make it slightly more economically difficult. One of the other things that used to happen in the slave plantations was that a shop would be opened up for the slaves, but it would be owned and run by the slave master, the plantation owner. And you can imagine in a situation where the slaves are getting a little bit too fattened, a little bit too comfortable, a little bit too educated, are beginning to ask inconvenient questions about their rights and their freedoms, and their productivity is diminishing. A very easy way of having a culling would be to raise the prices of the the articles in the shops. And so suddenly poverty starts to creep in. Suddenly people become fearful. And I have put forward the hypothesis that the whole of the United Kingdom has actually been run like a slave plantation ever since it was established. And what we're now seeing is actually a culling of the workforce. If you have a non-productive herd of livestock, you want to replace it with fresh
You're talking
livestock.
about not just, all across all strata of society, like white collar, blue collar, brown collar, everybody's being treated the same way?
Well, in the old plantations, you'd have the slave owner, you'd have the plantation owner, slave masters, you'd have slave breakers, and their job was to take slaves who were unmanageable and break them. And they would break them using the most horrific of techniques, all sorts of sexual depravity, physical violence, mental torture. These things were done to break human beings in the same way that they used to break horses and cows. So let's be ungenerous for a moment and assume that the United Kingdom is being run by people with the same mindset. They have no empathy and no attachment to the existing herd of livestock. So they will do everything to exert pressure, economic, emotional, and physical, to diminish them and weaken them, and then replace them. And if you have got the tools, the history, and the resources to be able to break in a new herd, then what would be the most productive? In the old plantation days, the most productive were the black bucks, the men who could be broken and held with shackles and beaten on whipping posts until they succumbed and worked day and night without their freedoms in the fields. Bring that into the modern day context. Maybe you have an explanation there as to why we are seeing so many young men of working age being brought into the United Kingdom and distributed all over the country. Now that is a better explanation, and all it requires us to do is to make one leap, and that leap is it possible that the ruling elite in the United Kingdom view the citizens as livestock?
I'm trying
Would you like me to expand on that a little bit further? Let me put a nail into the coffin of this conversation. Okay. You know, William Wilberforce, 1813 through to 1833, he is credited with having abolished slavery in the whole of the British Empire. What a magnanimous fellow he was. And we know that his thoughts about India were far from magnanimous. We know that he was responsible for opening the floodgates to missionary evangelical activity in India. But this notion that he got rid of enslavement is worth scrutinizing a little bit more. When they passed the law saying that you cannot hold slaves anymore, a payment was made to the British slave owners in the United Kingdom of some £20 million, okay, to recompense them as recompensation for their losses over in the new world, the new colony. That £20 million was repaid, and I think it finished in 2005. So that debt that had been made, so the Exchequer takes £20 million, says to these guys, here you go, here's your 20 million, now your losses are made good, and the Exchequer, the Treasury, will make good that loss from the people and their taxation. If the profit from slaves was private, why should the loss from the ending of slaves be public? Why should the British public be paying £20 million, which was taken...
million?
20 million it was at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, literally 20 million in pounds sterling. Unless, of course, the way your mind works is I have lost a herd of livestock in one country. So I'm going to get this herd of livestock to make good my losses over there. So I'm going to have them working harder for longer to recover the losses. And that's what the British people have been doing. In 2005, they made good that £20 million debt. And they were told that you guys have been a part of getting rid of slavery, right? But the money, the profit was private, the risk was public, the benefit was private, and the cost of it all was borne by the British herd. The herd of livestock in the United Kingdom actually made good the losses that the slave owners made as a result of losing their herd in the United States. Now that fits. All of that fits in really well. And remember that we have statements from people like Churchill and so on at that time, which broadcast and established really clearly what their view was of inferior races. You know, Churchill made that infamous statement where he said, "I do not accept that if a dog has been lying in a manger, irrespective of how long he has been lying in the manger, that he has a right to that manger." Okay? So that's a statement which is saying, I do not accept the principle of national sovereignty. If you've been living on a piece of land for a long period of time, if you're the dog in that particular manger, I don't accept that you have any right to it. This is pure illegality in today's world, but it gives you an idea of what he thought. And his next statement was, I do not admit that there is anything wrong with a race being replaced by a more superior race, a stronger race, a more refined race. Okay, and so first we've gotten rid of sovereignty and indigeneity, and then we have a purely racist statement, which is it's okay if I wipe you all out, genocide. So that wasn't challenged. These are not statements that suddenly everybody thought, oh my goodness, this is terrible, how horrible. Right? Everyone thought it was pretty okay. So if that's the mindset, which is looking at human beings in those terms, it's not too much of a leap to say actually it's the mindset of slave and plantation owners, and the British people are in fact at this moment in time being culled, and a replacement herd of livestock is being drafted in. It would also explain this nonsensical engagement in Ukraine. I'm sure you may have come across it, but up until the Ukraine war started, the perception of Ukraine was being a place which was full of child traffickers, organ harvesters, far-right extremist Nazi groups. And I think it was at the bottom of all of the democratic league tables for Europe. And now all of a sudden it's Ukraine, we have to go there and defend democracy. There was never democracy there in the first instance. But isn't it a wonderful a killing field where you can send white military-age young men who would defend the herd that you want to get rid of. So you create a killing field to send them, and then your culling continues, and you have a new herd in the wings, waiting, being fattened in 5-star hotels to be brought in as the next workforce. And this is blue sky thinking. There are some aspects of it which need a little bit more research, but it certainly fits as a better description of what's going on than the story that the mainstream media is telling us, that 𝗥𝗘 is a nice guy and he may be a little bit mistaken and he's just got into power and he's fumbling his way through. But I don't see that to be the reality. I think the analysis I put forward warrants a little bit further scrutiny. Or when I have the rest of the data compiled, then we shall publish it. And we'll probably call it Plantation UK or Plantation Earth, because their designs are not restricted to the United Kingdom. You can see how they made Africa into a plantation, a slave plantation. Whilst they were occupying Bharat, they made the whole of India into a slave plantation. And so they have a tendency to make nations into plantations. You exploit resources, you exploit humanity as a resource, and then when it's sucked dry, then you move somewhere else. And persons who have that sort of a moral code, it would not be too much of a leap for them to think, well, wouldn't the earth be a wonderful plantation? I think if you're addicted to the fruits of slavery, then there is no limit to the degree that you would want that addiction to be satiated. And I'm sure there are people, megalomaniacs still walk amongst us, who would be sitting there saying, what a wonderful thing it would be if the earth became our slave plantation. I hope that hasn't been too depressing, but it's an analysis which I think warrants further scrutiny. The the joker in the pack is Bharat. Okay? Because what we're seeing in Bharat is the creation of economic wealth without the exploitation of humanity. Right? And in such a short space of time, the unleashing of the creative power of good people is being felt tangibly, and it's rippling across the whole globe. Venezuela, in a very short period of time, they have turned their economy around into an economy which is productive.
I thought you meant Argentina.
Sorry, Argentina. Yeah. And so it's possible. And so why is it that the British and European economies have struggled for so long? They have tiny populations. They've had the resources of Croesus and the wealth of Kubeir, and yet they haven't managed to get stable economic activity. And that's by design, because they do not want to see it. It's not within their value system. This is my assertion. And so as Bharat becomes strong, and it teaches the world that it's possible for a harmonious, prosperous future, it threatens the hegemony of the globe which is built on slavery. And this will be the ultimate competition between a civilization built on free thinking, free expression, freedom of conversation, freedom of experimentation, versus enslavement, plantation, economic exploitation.
Guys, you may want to see this thing again.
The future is bright, the future is orange.
The future is bright, the future is orange. Thank you so much, sir.
It's a pleasure. Jai Shri Ram.